My name is Claire Monroe, and I was born 6 minutes before my twin sister, Lena. People love to say that twins share everything: birthday, laughter, even the same heartbeat before birth. But I learned early that in our house, sharing only applied to the things my parents didn't want to give twice. We grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a neat two-story house with white shutters and a maple tree that turned golden every fall. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family that could be on the cover of a real estate brochure. My parents smiling in coordinated sweaters, my sister in the middle with her perfect dimpled grin, and me, always just slightly to the side. My parents ran a small real estate business together. They worked hard, dressed well, and liked to remind us that appearances were everything. Lena was their favorite kind of daughter: bubbly, photogenic, the kind of girl who could make a room brighter by walking into it. Mom used to say she had star quality. I was quieter, more deliberate. I liked to draw, to read under the maple tree, to line my shoes up in perfect order. "You're too serious, Claire." Dad would sigh, half smiling, as if being thoughtful was a flaw I'd eventually outgrow. It started small, so small I almost missed it. On our 7th birthday, Lena got a new pink bike with a glitter seat and streamers that caught the sunlight. Mine was her old one, repainted white, still squeaking when I pedaled. "It's still good," Mom said as she handed it to me, her tone cheerful but final. I told myself it didn't matter, that we'd ride together anyway. But even then, I could feel something settle in me, a quiet understanding that love in our house had a hierarchy. The following year, we took a family photo for the Christmas card. Lena wore the red dress from Macy's, and Mom asked me to wear something neutral, to balance the shot. I remember standing beside them, my gray sweater blending into the background, watching Mom tilt Lena's chin toward the light. "Perfect," she said, snapping picture after picture. Later that night, I overheard her telling Dad, "Lena just photographs better. Claire's a bit serious." He chuckled. It was meant as nothing, but it carved something deep inside me. At school, teachers always mixed us up until they learned the difference. Lena, the performer; Claire, the thinker. It was said kindly, but I started to notice how kindness could also sting when it divided instead of joined. Mom signed Lena up for dance lessons and beauty pageants. I asked once to join an art class. She said, "Maybe later, honey. Those paints are expensive." The truth was, the money always appeared for Lena's dresses, makeup, and trophies. By middle school, the pattern was so established it felt like family law. On birthdays, Lena's presents arrived in glossy boxes wrapped with ribbons. Mine came with the phrase, "You can use hers after." When I got straight A's, Mom said, "That's great, but don't forget to cheer for your sister's recital." I learned to nod, to clap at the right moments, to swallow the ache before it turned into tears. I wrote about it in a small notebook I kept under my bed, the one place no one ever looked. Those pages became my quiet witnesses, filled with words I couldn't say out loud. I wish someone would see me first. Looking back now, I don't think my parents meant to be cruel. They simply mistook Lena's sparkle for value and my silence for strength. "You're tougher," Mom used to tell me when she skipped my turn for praise. "You don't need it like she does." I believed her for a long time. But toughness, I would later realize, was just another word for being left out. When I think of those early years, I don't remember loud arguments or open wounds. What I remember are the small, invisible cuts: a gift reused, a photo cropped, a compliment redirected. Each one tiny and forgettable on its own, yet together they built a quiet wall between me and them. I was loved, yes, but conditionally loved when I didn't take up space, when I made things easy. And even as a child, I could sense it. In our house, affection was not a birthright. It was a prize to be earned, and I had already fallen behind. By the time we turned 12, the differences between Lena and me had grown visible to everyone but our parents. She was the kind of girl who drew attention without trying: cheer squad, student council, school musicals. I was the girl who stayed late in the library, organizing my notes by color, preparing for exams weeks in advance. At Jefferson Middle School, Lena's laughter echoed through the halls. Mine echoed back from the pages of books. Teachers adored her energy. They said she brought life to the classroom. I brought test scores. One afternoon, our English teacher pinned Lena's poem on the board with a gold star. Mine, which won a district contest, was placed in a folder on the side table. "You both did great," she said kindly, but I saw where the eyes of the class went toward the sparkle, not the substance. At home, the pattern continued as though written into our DNA. Lena's room was a kaleidoscope of trophies, makeup mirrors, and glossy posters. Mine was plain white walls, a wooden desk, a lamp with a flickering bulb. Sometimes, when I passed by her room, I'd hear music and laughter. Mom would sit on the edge of Lena's bed, painting her nails, gossiping like two best friends. I would hover near the doorway, waiting to be noticed. When Mom finally looked up, she'd smile softly, almost apologetically. "Claire, can you be a dear and grab me the mail?" I'd nod and do it. That was our rhythm, Lena performing, me assisting. It was during those years I started writing more seriously in my journal. At first, it was just a place to list homework, but soon it became something else, somewhere I could exist without being compared. I'd write about small things, how the rain in Portland made the sidewalks smell like wet earth, how I wished for one conversation that didn't start with Lena this or Lena that. Some nights, I'd stay awake just to listen to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and let the silence remind me I was still there. At 13, I won the regional science fair. My project, a solar filtration prototype, was displayed in the gym, under fluorescent lights that buzzed like bees. I kept scanning the crowd for Mom and Dad, but they arrived late, just as the ceremony ended. "We hit traffic," Mom said, breathless, as Lena ran up to tell them she'd been picked to perform a solo at the spring recital. They turned their attention to her instantly, and I stood there, holding my certificate, like it was something fragile that might crumble if I gripped too tightly. That night at dinner, Dad clinked his glass and said, "To Lena, our little performer." Mom smiled proudly. Lena giggled, soaking in their warmth. I waited for someone to mention me, maybe even just a small nod toward the certificate still lying on the counter. Instead, Mom turned to me and said, "Claire, you should really go see your sister's rehearsal tomorrow. It'll be good for you to support her." I nodded, pretending the lump in my throat was just food stuck halfway down. At the recital, Lena was stunning, of course she was. The lights hit her hair, and she looked like something golden, untouchable. Mom cried. Dad filmed every second. I clapped too, smiling until my hands stung. When the applause died, Lena ran into our parents' arms. I stood a few steps away, invisible again. But what hurt most wasn't the neglect, it was realizing how normal it felt. In 9th grade, things didn't change much. Lena became homecoming queen, I became yearbook editor. She had photos of her crowning moment on the living room shelf. My name was misspelled in the print credits. Once, I confronted Mom gently, saying, "You forgot to come to my debate final." She smiled, brushing it off. "Oh honey, you're so good at those things, you don't need us there." That sentence burned longer than any insult could. In our family, being good was the same as being self-sufficient. There was one particular day that etched itself into my memory. I'd been nominated for the school's Academic Achievement Award. It was supposed to be a big moment, the kind parents record on their phones. I stood backstage, holding the program, searching the crowd. I saw rows of parents, clapping and waving to their kids. My seat in the audience was empty. I kept telling myself they were just late again. When they finally arrived, breathless, I'd already walked off the stage. They missed my name, my bow, the applause. But when Lena's class performed their dance routine an hour later, they cheered like it was the Super Bowl. After the ceremony, Mom hugged Lena tight, laughing through tears. "You were perfect," she said. When she turned to me, her tone softened, almost detached. "Oh, Claire, sorry we missed your bit. You understand, right? You're stronger than we think." I smiled, though something inside me quietly cracked. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Strength in this house means no one shows up for you." Over the next few years, I grew used to my own company. I learned to take the bus alone, to pack my lunches, to buy second-hand books instead of asking for new ones. My independence became my armor. It was how I protected myself from the sting of being overlooked. Teachers praised my discipline. Classmates came to me for help before exams. I smiled, offered my notes, and kept my distance. I wasn't bitter, at least. That's what I told myself. I was simply tired. Sometimes Lena would sense it and try to bridge the gap. "You're so smart, Claire," she'd say before running off to a party. "I could never do what you do." I wanted to believe her, but even her compliments felt like reminders of the separate worlds we lived in, hers full of light, mine built on quiet shadows. By 16, I had stopped waiting for applause. I didn't expect anyone to notice the report cards taped inside my locker, or the scholarship forms I filled out on my own. I didn't even mention them. I simply folded my achievements into the same silence I'd learned to live with. When Mom called me our strong girl, I stopped hearing affection. I heard excuse. Because in our family, strength wasn't a gift, it was permission for them to forget I still needed love. By the time senior year arrived, the unspoken hierarchy in our family had become something everyone accepted without question, like gravity. Lena and I both applied to the University of Washington in Seattle. It was Mom's idea, actually. "It'll be wonderful," she said, two sisters at the same school, looking out for each other. I smiled because that's what I always did. But deep down, I knew that even if we stood on the same campus, we'd still live in different worlds. The months leading up to decision letters were filled with nervous excitement. Lena decorated her room with college brochures and purple UW banners. She practiced her "Go Huskies" pose for photos she planned to post when the acceptance came. I filled out financial aid forms late at night, quietly scanning scholarship databases, knowing instinctively that I'd need them more than she ever would. The day the letters arrived, it was raining, the soft kind of Portland rain that never really stops, just hums quietly against the window. Dad brought in the envelopes, his voice full of pride. "One for each of you," he said, handing them out like golden tickets. We sat side by side on the couch, the same way we had on Christmas mornings when we were little. Lena tore hers open dramatically, gasping. I got in, her excitement filled the room. I opened mine more slowly, heart steady, already expecting what I'd worked for. "Me too," I said softly, showing them the acceptance letter. For a moment, we were equals, two girls who had reached the same summit. Mom clapped. Dad popped open a small bottle of champagne, and Lena took selfies with her letter. I stood in the background, smiling like I was part of something. For that brief evening, it almost felt true. But later that night, when the dishes were washed and the laughter had faded, I passed by my parents' bedroom. Their door was half closed, the light still on. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, I just froze when I heard my name. Mom's voice was soft but certain. "We should pay Lena's full tuition. She'll need it. Claire's different, she always finds a way." Dad hesitated. "You think she'll be okay handling it on her own?" "Of course," Mom said, almost proudly. "She's the strong one. She's resourceful. Lena needs more structure. More support." Their voices faded into the rhythm of the rain, but those words stayed sharp, clear, final. I stood there in the hallway, gripping the edge of the banister, feeling something hollow open up inside me. I'd always suspected that love in our house came with conditions, but hearing it confirmed, hearing my strength used as justification for neglect cut deeper than I could have imagined. The next morning, at breakfast, Mom announced it casually, like it was already decided. "Your father and I have talked. We'll cover Lena's tuition in full. Claire, honey, we'll help where we can, but you're so independent, I know you'll manage just fine." Lena looked up, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Wait, you're not paying for both?" Dad chuckled. "Your sister's the clever one. She'll get scholarships. Right, Claire?" I stared at my plate. There was a lump in my throat, but no tears came. "Right," I said. That one word felt heavier than anything I'd ever spoken. That afternoon, I walked home from school under a sky that looked like wet concrete. The wind smelled like pine and cold metal. I thought about all the times I'd been told I was the strong one. How that phrase had followed me through childhood, like a shadow sounding like praise, but feeling like abandonment. I realized then that strength had never been my choice, it had been their excuse. That night, I sat at my desk and opened my journal. The page was blank, but I already knew what I wanted to write. My pen moved slowly, the ink trembling slightly under the lamplight. I will not ask them for anything again. I closed the notebook and ran my fingers over the cover, tracing the word, Claire, embossed in gold. It was a gift from Grandma before she passed away, the only person who had ever looked at me like I was enough. I whispered her name quietly, then exhaled. It wasn't anger I felt, it was something quieter, colder. Acceptance. Over the next few weeks, I started working longer hours at the local bookstore. The owner, Mr. Jacobs, was kind. He let me take extra shifts and paid me in cash. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I didn't tell my parents about any of it. When Mom asked how things were going, I simply said, good. When she praised Lena for keeping her focus, I smiled. Sometimes, I'd see Lena packing for college with boxes full of things Mom had bought her: new bedding, clothes, even a mini fridge. You'll have everything you need, Mom said, taping up the last box. Then she turned to me, almost as an afterthought. Claire, make sure you keep track of your expenses, okay? You're so good at budgeting. I nodded, biting back the urge to say something, anything. But words felt pointless. They'd already written the story. They wanted to believe that I was strong, independent, immune to need. So, I played the role they gave me. On move-in day, Lena hugged Mom and Dad tightly, tears in her eyes. I'm going to miss you so much, she said. They promised to visit soon, their voices full of warmth. When it was my turn, the goodbye was quick, practical. Text us when you get settled, Dad said. Mom smiled. And remember, Claire, don't overwork yourself. You always do. Did my messes. I waved, climbed into my bus, and watched them fade into the distance. For the first time, I wasn't sad. I just felt untethered. The kind of free that also hurts. As the bus pulled away, the city stretched out before me: gray skies, wet streets, and the faint hum of something waiting. I opened my notebook one last time before closing it for the journey. Under the sentence from that night, I added one more line: from now on, my life belongs only to me. The first fall in Seattle smelled like rain and coffee. When I arrived at the University of Washington, I carried everything I owned in 2 suitcases and one worn-out box labeled books. My apartment wasn't really an apartment, it was a small studio above a dimly lit bakery in Chinatown. The rent was cheap, the walls were thin, and the ceiling fan clicked every few seconds like a heartbeat that couldn't rest. But it was mine. For the first time, every bill, every meal, every hour of sleep or lack of it was my responsibility. Meanwhile, Lena moved into one of the new on-campus dorms, the kind with marble countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Mom had helped her decorate it in shades of blush and gold. I saw pictures on social media, fairy lights, matching throw pillows, her smiling beside the caption, "Ready to make college memories." She looked radiant. I double-tapped the photo, even though it felt like liking a life I didn't belong to. Classes were demanding, but I loved them. I majored in finance. Numbers had always made sense when people didn't. I took morning lectures, worked at the university library in the evenings, and sometimes cleaned offices downtown on weekends. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to cover rent and instant noodles. At night, when the streets quieted, I'd sit by my tiny window, the smell of sesame buns drifting up from the bakery below, and watch the city lights shimmer like tiny promises. Lena and I didn't see each other often that first semester, though we were only a few blocks apart. When we did, it always felt like 2 parallel lines brushing for a moment before splitting again. Once, she invited me to a campus mixer. "You should come," she said brightly. "It's fun, free food, live music. People actually talk to each other instead of staring at spreadsheets." I laughed. "I'll pass. I have a night shift at the library." She frowned, not out of cruelty, but confusion. "You're always working, Claire. Don't you ever want to just enjoy things?" Her question lingered long after she left. Enjoy things. The words tasted foreign, like a language I hadn't learned. I wanted to tell her that enjoyment wasn't something I'd been taught, that when your worth depends on endurance, joy starts to feel like a luxury you haven't earned. But instead, I just smiled and said, maybe someday. Her world seemed to expand while mine contracted into a cycle of study, work, and exhaustion. She posted photos from sorority events, weekend trips to Portland, brunch with friends wearing matching UW hoodies. I memorized formulas under fluorescent lights, the hum of the library printer my only company. Sometimes, when my shift ended around midnight, I'd walk back to my apartment through the rain, my reflection stretching and breaking across the puddles. The city looked alive, laughter spilling from bars, headlights painting streaks of light, and I would wonder what it felt like to live inside that brightness instead of just walking past it. But there were small victories. When I aced my first economics exam, Professor Diaz wrote, "Outstanding clarity and insight" at the top of the paper. I took a photo of it, not to send to anyone, but to remind myself I could exist outside the shadow of approval. That night, I treated myself to takeout noodles and a secondhand novel from the bookstore down the street. For a few hours, sitting under the flickering bulb of my little room, I felt enough. Around winter break, Lena called. "Mom and Dad want to know your plan for Christmas," she said. "They're going skiing in Aspen, but you could come if you want." Her tone was warm, but I heard the distance underneath. "Thanks," I said. "I can't afford the trip, and I'm covering shifts at the library." There was silence on the line before she sighed. "You work too hard, Claire. You need to let yourself live a little." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Some of us have to work to live, Lena." She laughed softly, not catching the edge in my voice. That winter was one of the coldest Seattle had seen in years. The heater in my apartment broke for a week, so I studied wrapped in blankets, fingers stiff from the cold. I remember boiling water just to watch the steam fill the air. It made the room feel alive. Sometimes I'd see students rushing to parties, laughter echoing through the alleys, and I'd wonder if anyone ever felt invisible in a crowd the way I did in silence. Lena visited me once that spring, unannounced. She looked like she'd stepped out of a college brochure, curled hair, oversized hoodie, shiny nails. When she walked in, her eyes darted around my cramped room. "Wow," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "This is cozy." I offered her tea, the cheap kind that tasted mostly like water, and we sat on the edge of my bed because there was nowhere else to sit. She asked about my classes, I asked about her sorority. She told me about late-night pizza runs, movie marathons, and spring formals. Then she looked at me and said, "You should really know how to have fun, Claire. You're missing out on life." I smiled faintly. "Maybe. But fun isn't free." She frowned, like she didn't understand. And maybe she truly didn't. After she left, I sat by the window again, the city lights flickering below like scattered stars. I thought about what she said, "You're missing out on life." Maybe she was right. But as I looked down at my open textbook and the stack of scholarship applications beside it, I realized something she couldn't see. This life, however small, was mine. Every choice, every sacrifice, every late-night cup of coffee was proof that I wasn't just surviving, I was building something. Lena's world sparkled with borrowed light. Mine was dim, but it was honest. And that night, as I closed my journal, I wrote a single line: "Enjoyment is for those who are seen. Freedom is for those who make their own light." By sophomore year, exhaustion had become my constant companion. I had learned to balance class, 2 part-time jobs, and the endless dance of financial deadlines, but even my careful planning couldn't stretch far enough that spring. Tuition was due in 2 weeks, and one of my scholarships had been delayed because of a paperwork error. It wasn't much, just a few $1,000s, but to me, it might as well have been a mountain. For days I told myself I'd find another way, another shift, another grant, another miracle. But when the bursar's office sent the final notice payment required to avoid withdrawal, I sat on my bed, staring at the letter until the words blurred. The hum of the city outside sounded distant, like I was underwater. Then, Against every promise I'd made to myself, I picked up the phone. Mom answered on the third ring. Her voice was cheerful at first, the way it always was when she didn't expect anything from me. Claire, how are you, honey? Have you seen the pictures of Lena's new apartment? Isn't it gorgeous? I forced a smile she couldn't see. Yeah, it looks nice. Listen, Mom. I'm in a bit of a situation. There was a delay with one of my scholarships, and I need to cover part of my tuition. I'm not asking for money, just a loan. I'll pay it back once the funds come through. Thanks for watching. There was a pause, a faint sigh on the other end. Oh, Claire, she said finally, her tone turning from surprise to pity. You know your father, and I already committed a lot to Lena this semester. Her program fees were higher than expected, and we had to help with her travel fund. You'll manage though, right? You've always been so independent. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. It's just temporary, I said quietly. I wouldn't ask if it weren't urgent. When it winded Asian Bali. Sweetheart, she interrupted, her voice soft but unyielding, you're strong. You've always been able to figure things out. Lena isn't like that, she needs more support. You're resourceful, you'll find a way. For a long moment, I didn't respond. The words echoed like rain against a window, constant, predictable, and impossible to stop. Finally, I said, okay? She sounded relieved, almost proud. That's my girl. I knew you'd understand. I do, I replied. Then I hung up. The rain had started while we were talking. By the time I stepped outside, the streets were slick with it, and the air smelled like iron and wet asphalt. I didn't take an umbrella. I just walked. Past the neon lights of late-night diners, past the bus stop where students huddled under awnings, laughing and scrolling through their phones. My hair clung to my face, my clothes heavy with water, but I felt strangely calm. There was no anger left, only clarity. They had made their choice long ago, and tonight, I finally stopped pretending it could change. They had chosen the part of the world that shone, the daughter who sparkled under lights, who needed them to keep her glowing. I was the one they left in shadow, but maybe shadows weren't always a curse. Maybe they were where strength learned how to breathe. I stopped at a small park overlooking the water. The rain blurred the city skyline into a smear of gold and gray. My reflection in a puddle stared back at me, tired, soaked, but steady. You'll find a way, I whispered to no one, and somehow, the words didn't sound like a burden anymore. They sounded like a promise. The next morning, I went straight to the hotel across from campus where some of my classmates worked part-time as housekeepers. The manager, a tall woman named Denise with kind eyes, looked me over. You sure you want this? It's long hours and it's not easy work. I'm sure, I said. She nodded. All right, night shifts start at 8. We'll pay every Friday. That evening, I tied my hair back, slipped into the crisp uniform, and started cleaning rooms. It was quiet work, stripping sheets, scrubbing sinks, replacing tiny bottles of shampoo, but there was a strange dignity in it. No one knew my name there, no one compared me to anyone. Each room I finished was a small victory, a quiet declaration. I can build my life with my own hands. Between classes, the library, and the hotel, sleep became a luxury. I lived on caffeine and determination, my fingers permanently smelling of disinfectant and paper. Some nights, when I walked home past midnight, the streets empty except for the distant hum of traffic, I would look up at the dark sky and feel something close to peace. The stars were faint, hidden behind clouds, but still there just like me. One Sunday, Lena called. Mom said you've been busy. How's school? Fine, I said, folding linens between shifts. Are you coming home for spring break? Can't. Work. She hesitated. You work too much, Claire. You'll burn out. I smiled faintly. Maybe, but at least it's my fire. She laughed softly, not understanding what I meant. You're weird, she said fondly. After we hung up, I stood for a moment in the hallway, the sound of vacuums humming in the distance. I wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere between being the overlooked child and the self-sufficient student, I had stopped needing their permission to exist. By the end of that semester, I managed to pay off my tuition in full, No loans, no help, no debts, except the ones I owed myself. I kept the receipt pinned above my desk, right next to a quote I had written months earlier. They chose the light. I'll learn to see in the dark. It wasn't resentment that drove me anymore. It was resolve. The kind that doesn't shout or demand recognition, but simply keeps walking one rain-soaked step at a time. By junior year, the exhaustion that once defined me had turned into something sharper discipline. I had learned to live with very little sleep, little time, little approval. But I had also learned that when the world gives you silence, you can choose to fill it with effort. My GPA was nearly perfect. Every paper, every exam, every group project carried my quiet determination like fingerprints pressed into the pages. That fall, I took a course in advanced financial modeling taught by Professor Patrick Myers, a name that carried a mix of fear and admiration across the business school. He was one of those professors who never raised his voice but commanded the entire room. Former Wall Street analyst, turned academic, known for being precise and relentlessly fair. The first week, he gave us a problem set that half the class couldn't solve. I stayed up 2 nights in a row, my hands shaking from too much coffee, until I found the flaw in the dataset. When he handed back the papers, most were covered in red marks. Mine wasn't. Just one comment written neatly in the corner: "You saw what others missed. Don't lose that." It was a simple sentence, but I stared at it for a long time. No one had ever told me something like that before, not without an asterisk, not with quiet pride instead of surprise. It felt seen. A week later, after class, Professor Myers asked me to stay behind. "You're working 3 jobs, aren't you?" he said, matter-of-factly, looking over his glasses. I froze, unsure how he knew. "Your attendance record," he continued, "your assignments always turned in early, your eyes tired. I've taught long enough to recognize the kind of student who's building a life from the ground up." I nodded, unsure what to say. "Yes, sir. I work nights at the hotel and the library." He studied me for a moment. "Do you ever sleep?" "Sometimes," I said with a small laugh. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't pity but respected. "I'm looking for a teaching assistant for next semester. Someone detail-oriented, reliable, and most importantly hungry to learn. Are you interested?" For a second I thought I'd misheard him. Me? A TA? That role usually went to students with family connections or quiet confidence, neither of which I had. "Yes," I said finally. "I'm interested." "Good," he said, gathering his papers. "Meet me in my office Monday at 8 a.m. sharp. Bring coffee, I like mine black." That job changed everything. Working with Professor Myers pulled me into a different world, a world where effort was currency, not a consolation prize. He taught me how to read balance sheets the way artists read faces, how to question numbers until they revealed their story. Sometimes he'd stop mid-lecture and say, "Claire, walk them through your logic," and for a moment, the room would actually listen. My hands would tremble at first, my voice barely above a whisper, but each time I spoke, the tremor lessened. He had a way of challenging me without breaking me. "You're sharp, Claire," he'd say, "but you think like someone waiting to prove herself. Stop waiting." That sentence became a kind of mantra, one I repeated whenever self-doubt crept in. His office was a maze of old books and financial journals stacked to the ceiling, the air always smelling faintly of coffee and paper. Some evenings, when I stayed late to help him grade, he'd tell stories from his Wall Street years, how success meant nothing without integrity, how people lose themselves chasing what they once hated. I listened more than I spoke, storing his words like gold coins in my pocket. One night, as we wrapped up, he looked at me and said, "You know, Claire, you remind me of someone I used to know, a student who came from nothing, worked harder than anyone, and still doubted she belonged. She runs a Fortune 500 company now." I laughed, shaking my head. "That won't be me." "Why not?" he asked. "Because my family never saw me that way," I wanted to say. "Because I'm used to being invisible," but instead, I just shrugged. "I don't know." He studied me quietly. "Then figure it out. You can't build a life from humility alone. At some point, you have to believe you deserve the view from the top." Those words followed me everywhere. Under his mentorship, I started leading study groups, presenting projects, even applying for research competitions. My classmates began to see me differently, not as the quiet girl who sat in the back, but as someone worth listening to. And, slowly, I started to see myself differently too. I didn't know it then, but Professor Myers had already taken another step on my behalf. Without telling me, he had nominated me for the Ford and Levine National Scholarship, a prestigious award given to 5 finance students across the country. The kind of scholarship that opened doors to internships, jobs, and futures people like me weren't supposed to reach. The application required personal essays, transcripts, and letters of recommendation. He had everything ready except one thing: my signature. One afternoon, he handed me a sealed envelope. "Read this," he said. Inside was the application. My name printed neatly at the top, his recommendation attached. "You applied for me?" I asked, astonished. "I submitted it," he corrected. "You earned it a long time ago." I didn't know what to say. Gratitude felt too small, too fragile for what I felt in that moment. All I managed was, "Thank you, sir." He waved a hand dismissively. "Don't thank me yet. If you win, you owe me a good story." Thanks to the sword, I must admit, walking back to my apartment that night, I felt something I hadn't in years, a quiet pride that didn't need validation. For so long, I'd measured my worth through absence, what I lacked, what I'd lost, what I had to fight for. But in that moment, I realized value wasn't something others could assign or withhold. It was something you built, brick by brick, until even the people who never saw you couldn't ignore what you'd made. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote in my journal again, the same notebook that had carried me through every silent ache. Maybe strength isn't about enduring. Maybe it's about choosing to believe there's more to me than survival. Outside, the rain fell softly against the window. For once, it didn't sound lonely. It sounded like applause. It happened on an ordinary Thursday morning in late February, gray sky, weak sunlight slipping through the blinds, and the smell of cheap coffee in my tiny kitchen. I was halfway through grading papers for Professor Myers when my email pinged. Normally, I ignored notifications while working, but something about the subject line made me freeze. It read, "Congratulations, Ford and Levine National Scholarship recipient. It's wrong comment too hard." For a second, I just stared at the screen, rereading the words as if they might vanish if I blinked too hard. Then I clicked. "Dear Miss Claire Monroe," it began, "we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as one of 5 recipients nationwide for the Ford and Levine Financial Excellence Award." My hands trembled slightly. The letter went on to describe the benefits: full coverage for tuition, living stipend, mentorship from financial leaders in New York, but I barely absorbed the details. All I could think was how strange it felt to be seen, truly seen, by people who didn't even know me. I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't even call anyone. I just sat back, exhaled, and smiled. A small, quiet smile that belonged entirely to me. After years of being the invisible twin, I had finally achieved something that no one could overlook, yet no one would hear about it either. And that was fine. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like punishment, it felt like peace. That afternoon, as if on cue, my phone buzzed. It was Mom. "Claire, you won't believe this," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Your sister just got selected for the Paris exchange program. Isn't that incredible?" I looked at the emails still open on my laptop. "That's great, Mom," I said softly. "She must be thrilled." "Oh, she is," Mom continued. "It's such a wonderful opportunity for her, so international, so cultured. You know how much she loves Europe." "I know," I said, keeping my voice steady. There was a pause, the kind that often slipped between us now. Then she added, "I'm glad you're doing okay up there in Seattle too. You always manage somehow." This time back, that familiar phrase, "you always manage," it had followed me through every stage of my life like a shadow disguised as a compliment. "I'm doing fine, Mom," I replied. "Don't worry." She laughed lightly. "I never do." When we hung up, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the laptop screen again. 2 daughters, Two announcements, one celebrated, one forgotten, and yet, somehow I didn't feel forgotten anymore. That evening, I printed the scholarship letter, trimmed the edges neatly, and pinned it above my desk. The paper glowed softly under the lamplight. I didn't take a photo. I didn't post it anywhere. I just sat there, watching it flutter gently in the draft from the open window. Later, I opened my journal, the same one that held years of entries filled with longing, frustration, and invisible tears. On a fresh page, I wrote, "No one needs to know for it to be real. No one needs to see for it to have value. My worth doesn't live in their applause." For the rest of the semester, life moved quietly forward. I balanced research with my TA work, kept up with my classes, and helped Professor Myers prepare for his upcoming publication. Occasionally, he'd glance at me over his glasses with a knowing smile and say, "So, any interesting emails lately?" I'd just smile back. "A few." He never pressed. That was the thing about him, he seemed to understand that sometimes the victory itself was enough. Meanwhile, Lena's photos from Paris filled social media. She looked stunning, draped in scarves, smiling beneath the Eiffel Tower, surrounded by classmates. Mom commented on every post with hearts and exclamation points. Dad shared them on Facebook, writing captions like, "So proud of our girl living her dream." It's certain things. I scrolled through them one night while eating instant ramen at my desk, the scholarship letter still pinned in front of me. There was no jealousy, not anymore. Just an odd sense of calm. We were both living different stories, and for once, I was okay being the one whose story wasn't being told. In April, the university held an awards dinner for graduating seniors. Professor Myers insisted I attend. "No excuses," he said. "You've earned the right to stand in that room. Thanks for watching." It was held at a downtown hotel ballroom, all chandeliers and polished silverware. I borrowed a simple black dress from a friend and pulled my hair into a low bun. When my name was announced recipient of the Ford and Levine National Scholarship, Miss Claire Monroe, the applause sounded distant, almost dreamlike. I walked across the stage, accepted the plaque, and smiled for the camera. Somewhere deep inside, a younger version of me, the one who used to stand outside the frame of every family photo, finally stepped into the light. Afterward, as the crowd mingled, I stood near a window overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered like liquid glass, and I could see my reflection faintly in the pane. I thought of the girl who once walked home in the rain, whispering to herself that she would learn to see in the dark. She had done it. When I got home, I took the plaque out of its box and placed it beside the letter on the wall. Not as proof, but as reminder. Then I wrote one more line in my journal before bed. Some lights are quiet. They don't need an audience, they just need space to shine. And for the first time, I realized I had finally given myself that space. Graduation day arrived wrapped in sunlight and nervous energy. The quad at the University of Washington looked like a watercolor painting: green lawns, white tents, the distant shimmer of Lake Union. Students in purple gowns filled the air with laughter, selfies, and the metallic scent of excitement. I sat among them, my cap balanced neatly on my head, my tassel pinned to the right. Around me, families waved signs, shouted names, blew kisses. I had told myself I didn't care if my parents showed up. I had built a life without their applause. But when I spotted them walking across the lawn, Dad in a press suit, Mom in her pearl necklace, and Lena trailing behind with a camera around her neck, my breath caught anyway. They looked proud, almost theatrical, as if stepping into a scene they had rehearsed for years. "Claire," Mom called, waving. "You look beautiful." I smiled politely and waved back. I wondered if she noticed how her voice sounded a little too loud, as if trying to make up for all the silences that came before. Lena hugged me first, the tassel on her hat brushing against my cheek. "I can't believe we're done," she said, laughing. Her joy was real, unburdened. "Paris feels like a dream now." "It suits you," I said, and I meant it. The ceremony began soon after. Rows of chairs faced the stage, the massive screen broadcasting every moment. The dean spoke about resilience, about dreams, about perseverance through the pandemic years. I listened, the words drifting over me like distant waves. I'd lived them already. I didn't need to be reminded. When the names started being called, applause rolled across the crowd in waves. The camera operators panned through the students as each walked across the stage to shake hands with the faculty. I clapped for Lena when her name was read, Lena Monroe, Bachelor of Arts in Communications, with honors. Mom and Dad stood, clapping wildly, her camera flashing, Dad shouting, "That's my girl." I stayed seated, smiling. And then, a few minutes later, the announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. Next, we honor a recipient of the Ford and Levine National Scholarship, one of only 5 students nationwide to receive this distinction. There was a pause. The audience quieted. This year's award goes to Claire Monroe, Bachelor of Science in Finance, who has self-funded her education through 3 part-time jobs while maintaining a perfect academic record. The crowd erupted into applause. Loud, sustained, astonished applause. I felt it wash over me like a wave I hadn't expected. The big screen above the stage lit up with my name, and then my face. The camera panned toward the audience, searching for my family. I saw the lens catch them. Mom frozen mid-clap, Dad's smile faltering, Lena's eyes wide. It lingered for just a second, long enough for everyone to see. I stood slowly, my gown brushing against the chair, and began walking toward the stage. Every step felt like the closing of a chapter I'd been writing since childhood. The applause grew louder as I climbed the steps. Under the canopy of sunlight and cheers, I looked toward the faculty row where Professor Myers stood. He gave me a small nod, that same quiet approval he'd always offered when words were unnecessary. When the dean extended his hand, I shook it firmly. "Congratulations, Miss Monroe," he said. "Thank you," I replied. Then, softly, almost to myself, I did it. "Thank you for watching. A Burno and how to face 2 wort." The flash of cameras surrounded me, but the world had gone still. For once, the light didn't feel harsh or blinding, it felt earned. I walked back to my seat, my heart steady, my face calm. Around me, classmates whispered, "That's her, the scholarship girl," their voices filled with respect, not pity. I didn't need to look back to know my parents were still frozen in their seats, processing the image of their self-sufficient daughter standing in a spotlight they hadn't prepared for. When the ceremony ended, confetti filled the air like slow-falling rain. Families gathered in clusters for photos, laughter ringing through the courtyard. I found a quiet spot near the fountain, adjusting my cap as the sound of footsteps approached. "Claire," Mom said, her tone uncertain. "We didn't know. You never told us." I turned to face her. "There were a lot of things I stopped telling you," I said gently. Dad stepped forward, clearing his throat. "We're proud of you, truly. It's just, we had no idea you were doing so much on your own." I smiled faintly. That was kind of the point, wasn't it? Lena shifted awkwardly beside them. "Claire, that was incredible," she said, her voice trembling with genuine awe. "You worked 3 jobs? How did you even manage that?" I shrugged lightly. "The same way I managed everything else. One day at a time." Mom reached out, touching my arm as if testing whether the moment was real. "You should have told us, sweetheart. We could have helped." I finished for her, not unkindly. "You already helped Lena. That's okay. I just needed to help myself." For a moment, none of them spoke. The wind lifted my tassel, brushing it against my cheek like a whisper from another life. Finally, Lena said softly, "I'm sorry, Claire, for never seeing how hard it was for you." I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel anger. Only relief. "You see it now," I said. "That's enough. When one has been patted in." We stood there quietly, the 4 of us, the noise of celebration swelling around us like distant music. Later, as the crowd began to thin, Professor Myers found me by the fountain. "You handled that beautifully," he said. I smiled. I didn't say much. "Sometimes silence says everything," he replied. Then, with a twinkle in his eye, "Now go enjoy the rest of your day, Miss Monroe. You've earned the view. It's not waiting." When I finally walked away from the campus, the sun was beginning to set, painting the city gold. I carried my cap in one hand, the other brushing against the folded program tucked into my gown pocket. On its back page was the printed line I couldn't stop rereading. Ford and Levine National Scholars, recognized for perseverance and integrity. The words felt like a quiet benediction. That night, back in my apartment, I hung the gown carefully by the door and placed the program beside my scholarship letter on the wall. I lit a single candle on the windowsill, its flame reflecting softly against the glass. For years, I had chased light that never turned toward me. Now, standing there in its glow, I realized I didn't need it to. I was the light. The crowd had already thinned when I finally stepped outside the auditorium. Streamers fluttered in the late afternoon breeze, and the scent of fresh-cut grass mixed with the faint sweetness of the flowers families had brought for their graduates. My cap hung loosely in my hand, the tassel tangled in my fingers. The noise of celebration faded behind me, replaced by the soft crunch of gravel under my shoes. I found my parents and Lena waiting near the fountain, the same one where we'd taken photos 4 years earlier during orientation. Back then, Mom had stood proudly between us, arms around each of our shoulders, smiling like we were two halves of the same dream. Now, that same fountain seemed to divide us instead of connect us. Mom was the first to speak. "We didn't know it was this big," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The scholarship, the work, everything. Claire, you should have told us." I looked at her, not unkindly. "If you had known," I asked quietly, "would you have come today?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. The silence stretched between us like a confession. Dad stepped in, trying to soften the moment. "Claire, that's not fair. We always thought you were doing fine on your own. You've always been strong, stronger than anyone we know." I met his eyes. "I'm strong because I had to be," I said evenly. "But strength isn't the same as not needing love. It just means I learned how to live without it." He flinched slightly, the truth landing heavier than I intended. "We never meant to make you feel alone," he said. "We just thought you didn't need as much as Lena did." "That's exactly what I mean," I replied softly. "You thought I didn't need. That's how you justified it. But needing less doesn't mean needing nothing." Mom's eyes glistened, the first hint of tears I'd ever seen in a conversation like this. "We were proud of you," she whispered. "We just didn't say it enough." I smiled faintly, though my throat felt tight. "You didn't have to say it. But maybe you could have shown it." Lena had been quiet the whole time, her camera dangling uselessly from her wrist. Now she spoke, her voice shaking. "Claire, I didn't know how much you were doing on your own. I didn't want to see it. It was easier not to." I turned to her, studying the familiar face that mirrored mine. "You didn't want to see it because it would have made you question what you were given," I said. "And maybe that's human. We all protect the story that makes us feel safe." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'm sorry. For all the times I didn't notice, for thinking love was something that had to be earned with attention. You deserved it too." Her voice broke on the last word, and something inside me softened. "It's okay," I said gently. "You know now. That's enough." "Wait, do has told Ben." We stood in silence, the four of us, with the city glinting in the distance. The wind rippled the surface of the fountain, breaking the reflection of the sky into fragments. I realized that this moment, awkward, raw, imperfect, was the closest thing to honesty we had ever shared. Mom stepped closer, hesitating before touching my arm. "What happens next for you?" she asked. "I'm moving to New York," I said. "The scholarship includes a position with Ford and Levine after graduation." "When love," explained my down to him. Her eyes widened. "New York? That's so far away." I shrugged lightly. "It's where the work is. Where I can start over." Dad smiled, a small, uncertain smile. "We're proud of you, Claire. We really are." I nodded, not because I needed the words, but because I understood how hard it was for him to say them. Lena wiped her tears and laughed weakly. "You'll probably be running the company in 5 years." I smiled. "Maybe 10. It's not wait it," For a while, we talked about small things: Lena's future plans, Mom's new listing in Portland, the weather. Ordinary topics, but they felt like tentative bridges over deep water. The kind you cross slowly, testing each step. When the conversation faded again, I reached into my bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the printed scholarship letter I'd kept with me all day. I handed it to Mom. "This is for you," I said. "In case you ever wonder what I was doing all those years you thought I was too busy." She took it gingerly, as if it might burn her fingers, her eyes scanning the text. When she reached the line that mentioned 3 part-time jobs to self-fund tuition, her hand went to her mouth. "Claire," she whispered. "It's okay," I said quietly. "You don't have to say anything." Lena reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. "You really did it, didn't you?" "I did," I said. Then, with a faint smile, we both did. The sun was dipping lower now, the sky painted in streaks of orange and violet. The light caught the edge of Lena's cap, the shimmer of Mom's pearls, the reflection on Dad's watch. For a fleeting second, the 4 of us were cast in the same warm glow, equal, if only by the grace of sunset. When it was time to go, Mom hugged me first. It wasn't one of those quick, polite embraces she used to give. It was hesitant at first, then tighter, her chin resting against my shoulder. "We'll do better," she said softly. "I can't change the past, but I can try to understand it." I nodded against her shoulder. That's all I ever wanted. Dad hugged me next, awkward but sincere. "You've made us proud," he said again. And when I turned to Lena, she just threw her arms around me and whispered, "I love you, Claire." "I always did. I just didn't know how to show it." "I know," I said. "It's enough that you're saying it now." As I walked away, the sound of celebration rose again in the distance, the laughter of other families, the music, the cheers. I didn't look back this time. I didn't need to. The past had already been acknowledged, forgiven, and left standing where it belonged. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking toward myself. The city greeted me with noise, a beautiful, relentless kind of noise that made you feel alive whether you wanted to or not. I arrived in New York on a damp September evening, my single suitcase clattering behind me as I stepped out of LaGuardia Airport. The air smelled of rain and exhaust, of something restless and electric. Cabs honked in the distance, lights from the skyline flickered like stars that had fallen too close to Earth. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in. This was the beginning. My apartment was a 5th-floor walk-up in Brooklyn, small, barely furnished, and loud enough to make me aware of every neighbor within 3 blocks. But to me, it was freedom wrapped in brick and chipped paint. The first night, I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by unopened boxes, eating cold Chinese takeout straight from the container. Out the window, the city glowed, 1,000 tiny windows shimmering like possibilities. Somewhere between exhaustion and awe, I realized I didn't feel lonely. I felt unburdened. The next morning, I began my first day at Ford and Levine. The office was in Midtown, on the 35th floor of a glass tower that seemed to pierce the clouds. The elevator ride up felt like stepping into another version of myself, one that belonged, one that didn't need to explain her place in the room. When the doors opened, I saw rows of desks, the low hum of conversation, the click of heels on marble floors. My badge read Claire Monroe, Junior Analyst. For a moment, I ran my thumb across the letters, just to remind myself they were real. The orientation felt like a blur: introductions, handshakes, business cards. But when I finally sat at my desk by the window, overlooking the grid of Manhattan streets below, I felt something click into place. The city buzzed beneath me, endless and indifferent, yet somehow it mirrored the rhythm of my own heartbeat. During lunch, my supervisor, a sharp woman named Elise, stopped by. "Patrick Myers speaks highly of you," she said. "He said you're relentless." I smiled. "I try." She nodded approvingly. "Good. In this city, relentless is the minimum requirement." That night, after work, I walked through Times Square just to see it once. The lights were overwhelming: advertisements, billboards, people moving in every direction, but instead of feeling small, I felt powerful. For the first time, the brightness didn't belong to someone else. It didn't blind me or demand anything from me. It just existed, and so did I. A few days later, I received a text from Mom. It was short, carefully worded. "We're so proud of you, Claire. You've worked so hard for this." I read it twice before replying. Me. Thank you. I'm busy, but I appreciate it. It wasn't cold, just factual. A truth between two people who were still learning how to speak without old wounds echoing between them. In quieter moments, I'd catch myself thinking about Portland, the maple tree that turned gold every fall, the smell of wet sidewalks, the house where I once stood slightly outside every family photo. The memories didn't hurt the same way anymore. They felt like museum exhibits behind glass, still visible, but no longer reachable. I had stopped needing them to make sense. On weekends, I explored the city with the curiosity of someone seeing color for the first time. I'd walk through Central Park at sunrise, stop at small coffee shops tucked between high-rises, lose myself in the noise of street musicians on Fifth Avenue. I bought secondhand books from a shop near Union Square and filled my apartment with them until the walls felt like they could breathe. Sometimes, late at night, I'd stand by the window of my apartment, looking across the skyline at the lights burning in office towers that never seemed to sleep. Each one represented someone's ambition, someone's fight. I touched the glass, watching my own reflection blend with the city's glow. "Now I know," I whispered. "The light was never theirs to give. It was mine all along." One evening in early winter, I received a letter at work addressed in familiar handwriting, Professor Myers. Inside was a single line written in his neat script. "The world doesn't reward silence, Claire. Keep speaking with your work." Tucked behind it was a small bronze pin engraved with the words "Integrity and Grit, Ford and Levine Scholars, Class of 2024. I pinned it to my desk partition. Every time I felt unsure, I'd glance at it and remember the promise I made years ago that I would build my life with my own hands. By December, I had settled into the rhythm of the city. The loneliness that once shadowed me in Seattle felt different here, not hollow, but vast, full of potential. I even started painting again, something I hadn't done since childhood. My first canvas was of the skyline at dusk, the glass towers melting into amber light, each one glowing like a heartbeat. One night, after finishing a project deadline that had kept me in the office past midnight, I rode the elevator down alone. The city outside was drenched in rain, the streets reflecting the golden light of the buildings. I paused at the lobby window and saw my own reflection superimposed over the skyline, not the quiet, uncertain girl from Portland, but a woman who had built her own world from silence. I smiled to myself and stepped out into the rain, without opening my umbrella. The cold drops felt like applause from the sky. For years, I had chased warmth from others, the kind that flickers and fades. But here, in the city's glow, I finally understood. Freedom isn't about being seen. It's about seeing yourself clearly, even in the dark. And as I crossed the street, lights shimmering on the wet pavement, I whispered again, "The light doesn't come from them. It comes from me." A year later, I found myself back in Portland for the first time since graduation. The plane descended through a blanket of gray clouds, the city below glistening from recent rain. Even from the sky, it looked softer than I remembered, smaller, quieter, like a photograph left too long in the sun. When I stepped outside the terminal, the air was damp and familiar, carrying that distinct scent of pine and nostalgia. It was strange how memory could cling to a place like mist, no matter how far you ran. Mom had texted that morning, "Dinner at 7, just family." No exclamation points, no emojis. It felt intentional. I drove the rental car through the old neighborhoods, past the park where Lena and I used to race our bikes, past the house with the red shutters where we'd take Christmas photos every year. Everything was the same, and not the same. Paint faded, trees taller, the streetlights still flickering before they turned on. I parked in front of the house and sat for a minute before going in, watching the warm light spill through the curtains. When I walked inside, the smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air. Mom was in the kitchen, wearing the same apron she'd had since I was 12, the fabric faded but still intact. Dad stood by the counter, carving meat with quiet focus. Lena was setting the table, humming softly to herself. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mom turned, her eyes widening slightly as if she still couldn't believe I was there. "Claire," she said softly, drying her hands. "You look, well, there is tender 85. I said. And I meant it." Dinner was quiet at first. The clinking of silverware filled the silence that words didn't dare cross. We talked about small things: the weather, work, a new neighbor who'd painted their house bright blue. The conversation tiptoed around the past, careful not to wake it. Halfway through the meal, Mom set down her fork. "There's something I need to say," she began, her voice trembling just slightly. "We were wrong, Claire. About a lot of things. You didn't deserve to feel like you had to earn our love. You've always been worthy. We just didn't see it soon enough." I looked at her for a long moment. There was no satisfaction in hearing it, no vindication, only a quiet, unexpected tenderness. "I stopped needing to prove that a while ago," I said gently. "But thank you for saying it." Dad nodded slowly. "We're proud of you, kiddo. Truly proud." Lena, who had been silent until then, smiled shyly. "You're basically a legend at your old school, you know. They still talk about your scholarship." I laughed softly. "I doubt that." She shook her head. "It's true. And I actually wanted to ask you something." She hesitated. "There's a fellowship program I've been thinking of applying for. It's competitive, and I'm not sure where to start. Could you look at my draft?" For a moment, I just looked at her, the sister who once had everything I thought I wanted. The envy I used to feel had dissolved long ago, replaced by something gentler. "Of course," I said. "Send it to me. I'll help however I can." Her shoulders dropped in relief. "Thanks, Claire. You've always been the one who figures things out." I smiled. "Maybe, but this time, I'll help you figure it out too." After dinner, we lingered in the living room, sipping tea. The house creaked the same way it always had when the wind pressed against the windows. Mom asked questions about New York, my apartment, my job, whether I'd made friends. I told her about the city lights, about walking home late and feeling the pulse of the city beneath my feet. She listened quietly, no interruptions, no comparisons. Just listening. When the clock struck 9, Lena started packing up leftovers, and Dad went to rinse dishes. Mom stayed seated across from me, her hands folded on her lap. "You seem different," she said softly. "Lighter." "I am," I replied. "I stopped chasing what was never mine to begin with." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "You found peace, then?" "Maybe not peace," I said, "but clarity. And that's enough." Later, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked into the dining room. The table was still set with half-melted candles and the faint scent of dinner lingering in the air. On the sideboard sat a framed photo I hadn't seen in years, the one from our childhood Christmas card. Mom, Dad, Lena in her red dress, and me, half out of frame, smiling because that's what I'd been told to do. I picked it up and studied it under the dim light. The photo no longer hurt. It just told the truth of who we were back then, a family learning, failing, and trying in their own flawed way. I set it down again, then took a small candle from the cabinet and lit it, placing it in the center of the table. The flame flickered softly, reflecting off the glass frame. I whispered to myself, some people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen by their parents. I just needed to learn how to see myself. Outside, snow began to fall, gentle, soundless, erasing the sharp edges of the world. I stood there watching it through the window, the candlelight warm against the cold blue of the night. Before turning away, I adjusted the photo so that all four of us were centered again. Not because I wanted to rewrite the past, but because it felt right to let it rest where it belonged. Then I went upstairs, opened my journal, and wrote one final line. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's knowing the story could have broken you, but you chose to finish it your way. Downstairs, the candle burned steadily, its flame unwavering, quiet, self-made, and free.